Hey, good morning, Foundry. My name is Austin, if we've not had the chance to meet yet. I am the associate pastor here at the Foundry, and I am excited to get to share with you the last week of this series, Do I Even Need This? Now, over the last 4 weeks, we've been looking at some of these questions that oftentimes we may have about the church, or about God, or about Jesus. We ask in week 1, do I even need this? And the answer is obviously yes, because Jesus is Lord, even when Christians don't represent him well. In week 2, we talked about how the church is God's idea and how it is the chosen vessel that he is using to spread the good news. In week 3, we talked about how Christian community is a distinct community. And in week 4, we talked about how this is a place that we can bring our whole selves. And if you've missed any of those weeks, I'd encourage you to go to YouTube, check out the message there, and get caught up on the series. And today we're going to be looking at something that's a little bit different, which you're going to catch a little bit even just in the other elements today. We're going to be looking at the idea that the church allows us to connect with and learn from the history of the people of God. So if you missed it, the first 2 songs we sang today are hymns. All we're singing today are hymns. And we're going to be practicing through looking at some historical prayers in a little bit as well. Over the last year, I've had a lot of existential questions and concerns. I don't know if you're like me. And I think a lot of it is because we have had a society that has completely changed, right? And not just that, but we've also just been constantly surrounded by this idea of death. Like, you turn on the TV and there's literally like these tally marks going up each and every day of how many people who have passed away because of COVID. And it's not just because of COVID, but I feel like some of the stories that have also broken through over the last year have also just centered around the idea of death. And so we are just constantly surrounded with this idea. Even our dreams and our ideas and our passions for many of us have died this last year. And it's for this reason that I think it's important that we take time and we learn from the history of the people of God, because it can help ground us. It can help disentangle us from our minds rapidly conjuring up these existential questions and crises. And instead we can center ourselves on who we are called to be as an expression of the people of God, learning from past paradigms of the people of God. But what is the purpose of looking back? Because I think for many of us, we live in a culture where just 5 years from now will feel completely irrelevant, right? Just look at music from 5 or 10 years ago and you listen to it and you're like, man, that just has a very old school vibe to it. And you're like, that was 5 years ago. Because our culture moves at a very quick pace. And there are benefits to this idea of pursuing relevancy. Like, we were a church that for over a year were able to meet online because of public health and safety. We were able to then transition to a time where you can sit on your couch at home and you can be a part of our church community, but you can also be in this room and be a part of our church community. This is a luxury and an innovation that the church in previous iterations did not have. And if you're interested in helping us make that happen, please talk to me, because we would love to utilize you on the production team. Or you can email me at Austin@foundrybaltimore.com. But I think this pursuit of relevancy often misses the wisdom and the experience and the practices, the paradigms that have been expressed in and through the people of God throughout history. We live in a culture that values time and money above all else, but we would learn a lot from just grasping some of the concepts that other cultures have when it revolves around honor and elevating their elders and their ancestors. As Spanish philosopher George Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So what can we gain when we connect with and learn from the history of the people of God? I think there's quite a bit. I'm going to highlight just 4 things today. The first thing I think that we can gain is that we are reminded of what God has done. The Bible as we have it right now, if you are in this room and there's one in the back, they're not in the back of the pews right now, but if you have one with you, or it's on your phone, or you're joining us and it's in your living room with you, there's been significant edits made to that over the history of time. To create the Bible as we know it, at some point they had to accumulate all of these separate writings, because one of the beautiful things about the Bible is that it is written by all of these different authors coming together to tell the story of God. There's this historical book called Second Maccabees that was written in the 2nd century BCE that actually tells us who were the people that accumulated the Old Testament books. They credit it to two people. It says this: Nehemiah founded a library, who we just talked about for a whole series. He founded a library and collected the books about the kings and the prophets and the writings of David and the letters of the kings about votive offerings. In the same way, Judas Maccabeus also collected all of the books that had been lost on account of the war that had come upon us, and they're in our possession. So for quick reference, Judas Maccabeus, if you don't know who he is, he's this Jewish man in the 2nd century BCE, and he is a leader of a revolt against the Seleucid state, which is one of the states of the Greek Empire at the time. He is very much a person that is trying to bring about the idea of the Messiah through violence. But he and Nehemiah are credited for accumulating all of the books of the Old Testament. And not long after that, the Jewish religious leaders came together and they put together what they call the Tanakh, also known as the Hebrew Bible, or our Old Testament. And why is this important? Why am I talking about all of this? Well, it's important because the Bible is not written in a chronological order that oftentimes we like to think of things through the lens of. In fact, it's written kind of categorically. Why? Because they wanted to tell the story of God in a specific way. And so they start with what they call the Torah, or the law. It's the first 5 books of our Old Testament. And they do this because they want to draw out a specific theme. The theme that God acts first. And then he calls his people to respond to his grace. In the book of Exodus, we find God liberating the people of God. They're enslaved and they are oppressed. And he comes and he steps in and he liberates Israel. And it's only after he frees them that the law even comes into focus. We read in Exodus 6, God giving Moses these directions. He says, "Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to a land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord." So what has God done? He has generously acted first. Therefore, the calling into law that we find in some of the Old Testament scriptures comes in the context of relationship. It doesn't come out of nowhere. God's not dropping this to-do list on the Israelite people, but instead he comes and he says, I'm going to free you from your enslavement, and then I'm going to tell you what I would like for you to do to respond to that. Whereas Karen Gonzalez writes this: God is present with anyone who is treated as a human resource instead of a human being. Later on in the Old Testament, we find this other group of writings called the Nevi'im, or the prophets. These are books that focus on characters who enter the story of God at a specific point in time where Israel has chosen to forget about the actions of God. And their message over and over and over again to the Israelite community is to remember what God has done. That he has taken the first step. Because when we remember what God has done, we cannot forget what we're called to be. This isn't just one person or one prophet, but over and over and over again, we read this story where they call the people of God to remember what has taken place. Christopher J.H. Wright says this, that ethical obedience is a response to God's grace, not a means of achieving it. God continues to put people in place to remind Israel over and over again how to respond to his grace. Because this is what God has done. Frequently, when we read historical books as well, if you like many things from history, I think oftentimes we read books that are written through the lens of the triumphant or the oppressor. Interestingly, though, the Bible is different because it is written through the lens of the oppressed and has been able to withstand history. All the New Testament and the majority of the Old Testament were written through the eyes of the oppressed or written by the oppressed, and yet the story of the people of God lives on. It, in and of itself, is miraculous that we have it. Maybe even without some sort of divine intervention, we may not have the Word of God. Not only has God provided His Word, but it's lasted for thousands of years. For example, the New Testament is written by a group of authors that are mostly Hebrews with a couple Gentiles, and they're living in the Roman Empire. And if we know anything about the Roman Empire, if you've done any sort of study on them, we know that the Roman Empire maintained peace through brute force. In fact, as far as we know it, all of the authors faced significant persecution and punishment and oftentimes death for what they taught. And yet somehow their works were able to survive. Even with much resistance to the powerful kind of written in the form of hidden transcripts in the text. So by connecting with and learning from the people of God, we can remember what God has done by acting first in grace, giving His people these continual reminders over and over again, and by making sure that we today, thousands of years later, have His writings, His word, and it has lived on. Instead of despondency, instead we can have hope for what is to come in the future. The second thing I think that we can take away when we connect with and learn from the people of God is we can see how faith has evolved and shifted over time. As I mentioned earlier, the first few books of the Old Testament are oftentimes called the Law. And if you read through some of these texts, you'll see particular and precise restrictions and directives, right? Many of us know Jewish customs, specifically when it comes to food and kosher practices, which come from Deuteronomy 14. We can find that in our Old Testament. And it restricts the eating of things such as ox and sheep and goat and deer and gazelle and pigs and anything from the sea without scales, and eagles and vultures and falcons and ravens and owls and bats and flying insects, to name a few. At a point there, it kind of sounds like every NFL team. But But why are there these restrictions? It's because the people of God at that point in time need to be markedly different from the surrounding nations, the surrounding cultures. And God graciously gives them a way to do that. This does not mean that we all need to go away from this and be like, man, I can't enjoy blue crab today. But because this was given to them at a specific point of time, it is a paradigm of what the people of God looked like at that time. The evolution here is that God is gifting the Israelites the law after previously not having it, not having such a writing or directives of what they should be doing. Maybe there's a way that God has graciously called us today to be markedly different from those who don't identify as the people of God. But the evolution of faith extends even when we read into the New Testament. We read Matthew 5, where Jesus is giving His most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And here, Jesus lays out the idea of what the people of God should be like at that time. He does this, and He states this: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, I've come to fulfill them." Jesus then begins to take Old Testament laws and He begins to reinterpret them to fit the modern culture, the modern paradigm. He begins to say this refrain over and over again. You've heard it said this, but I tell you this. Because He's taking the law that was previously given to the Israelite community and contextualizing it to the modern model, because faith had evolved at that point. No longer are the people of God called to love their neighbor and to hate their enemy, but instead they're called to love their enemy and pray for those who persecute them. Here we see how faith has evolved when it's connected with and learning from the history of the people of God. Sometimes, I get annoyed with sometimes when we take ourselves and we put ourselves at the center of conversations that we don't really belong. I don't know if you guys experience this as well. Where we think that we are a society or a culture that are new to doing things, or new to thinking about certain things a certain way. And I think one example of this is honestly the modern deconstructionist movement in Christian faith. And I'm not against the idea of going back to go forward or getting down to the nitty-gritty and the bones. What I do have issue with is sometimes we think we're the first generation to do this. But if you look at the Bible, if you look at church history, it's everywhere. I mean, look no further than Acts 15. For example, if you look early on in church history, there are councils after councils where people get together to decide what are the core theological convictions that we have and what can we kind of place to the side. And there's this really cool thing, if you read through church history as well, where a couple years later or a couple centuries later, they get together and they go, you know what? I know that we met for years talking about this thing, but we need to amend that because that was wrong. There's this change. This evolution of sorts of what they believe. Or let me highlight a few ideas from the Reformation movement, which many of us are familiar with. First, 1517, Martin Luther hangs the 95 Theses from the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the points of the 95 Theses is this idea of this perceived poor translation, that the Roman Catholic Church had understood this one word as penance. But when he dug into the Greek language, he believed that it actually was repentance. This distinction sparked a great debate and ultimately led to one of two of the biggest splits in church history. All because Luther decided to look at the scriptures through a different lens, through a different language than the Roman Catholics were doing at the time. Or how about this? A little bit less familiar, but around the same time, there was this group of people known as the Anabaptist, which oftentimes when we hear that, we're like, oh, okay, it was, descendants are now the Baptists. But it's not. Actually, the descendants today would be more like the Mennonite community or the Amish community. And the Anabaptists, one of the interesting things about them was they actually sparked the movement for immersion baptism. At the time, that wasn't a part of Protestantism at all. They believed that faith was different now and that sprinkling an infant wasn't going to cut it, but instead that we needed to immerse adults. And faith evolved in a way that many present-day denominations accept that as immersion be it adult or sprinkling as a child as the way to do it. The church's view changed over time. And this happens even with people leading the charge that have kind of problematic theological convictions, such as Luther's view in his anti-Semitism. It happens even when the church tries to stop it. Like, for example, Justo L. Gonzalez writes this about the Anabaptist movement. He says, the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church martyred many Anabaptists in the 16th century, probably more than those who died in the first 3 centuries of persecution preceding Constantine in Rome. With ironic cruelty, many Anabaptists were drowned. So what we did as the church, we didn't want it to evolve, and so what did they do? They drowned people. Other Christians. When we connect with and we learn from the people of God, we see how faith is evolving and shifting over time in the Old Testament with Jesus through church history. And it helps us live out our faith in a more contextual way to today rather than just recapitulating what we've already seen that was intended for a different iteration of the people of God. Thirdly, when we connect with and we learn from the people of God, we develop better spiritual practices. One way we can do this is to learn from spiritual practices of old. We find all throughout Scripture these different moments where authors of the Bible, characters of the Bible, are worshiping God through song, where they're praying prayers of intercession, where they're reading and interpreting the Scripture. One of the most profound places that we know of to develop these spiritual practices is to work through some of the Psalms. Now, the Psalms are these short poems, oftentimes short, some of them are a little bit longer, but they're written to God expressing this rawness and this emotion of whatever the psalmist is feeling. And I think one of the ways that we can cultivate our spiritual practices is even sometimes using the Psalms as a template for our own spiritual practices. So that way we can write our own poems with our own emotions that sometimes are hard for us to feel or express. Take this, for example, Psalm 3, which will come up on the screen. Verses 1 through 2 say this, "O Lord, I have so many enemies. So many are against me. So many are saying, God will never rescue him." So we can take this as a template and we can say, hey, let me address God and let me tell him what's going on in my relationships, what's troubling me about those who I am in relationship with. Verse 3, it says this, "But you, O Lord, are a shield around me. You are my glory, the one who holds my head high. So as we are admitting to God what's troubling us about our relationships, we can write down the truths that we remember about God, even while we're struggling and troubled by our relationships. Or then in verse 7, it says this a couple verses later, "Arise, O Lord, rescue me, my God." So then we can write down, what are we asking God for? Amid admitting what is troubling us about our relationships, amid looking and admitting about what we know about God, now the question is, what are we going to ask him for? This is a simple example that shows how we can kind of just learn from some of these old practices and use them in a more modern context, applying them to our own life, both for personal and communal spiritual practices. In developing these spiritual practices, we can also lean on the methods of others. In the 16th century, there's this guy named Thomas Creamer who decides to make scripture and spiritual exercises more available to those who are interested, specifically in the English language. Because at the time, the Roman Catholic Church taught in Latin, and the Protestant Church oftentimes taught in German. It was because of this that he put together what's called the Book of Common Prayer. This text took many old and sacred prayers written in Latin, and it translated them into English, thus centralizing this work where then his peers could come together, and they could pray, and they could read, and they could worship the text in their own heart language. Today, we can learn from these works and other works like this as kind of a fulcrum of our spiritual practices. And when we encounter some intense emotions, we don't know what to do with them, sometimes the best thing we can do is just to recite a prayer that someone else has previously written that was under similar circumstances, a similar emotional state. And in a bit, we're going to be practicing this. Scott's going to lead us in a way of reflecting on this and practicing this. We can also develop these spiritual practices by listening to the depths of wisdom of those who experience these spiritual practices in a way that maybe we don't, or in a way that we won't or can't have the opportunity to. Whether that is from different eras of time because the time period looked a little bit different, so they're practicing in a different way, or that's by looking at the example of others, such as monastics, and just saying, what can I take away from their experience, from their practices? When we connect with and we learn from the people of God, we develop these spiritual practices, and it gives us an increased confidence and fewer excuses, honestly, to engage with these practices. The last point I want to talk through is when we connect with and we learn from the people of God, we see a diverse people representing what's called the Imago Dei, or the image of God, worshiping God. We see a diverse people representing the image of God all throughout church history. And one thing I think is most beautiful about church history, honestly, is that the church adapts and it moves, no matter what the culture, no matter what the social acceptance of the church is. As Dr. Ian Malcolm claims in the theologically rich movie Jurassic Park, life finds a way. And in the same way, throughout all of church history, the church finds a way. It's true in the ancient Roman church, when the church was viewed as incestual, cannibalistic pagan worshipers because they were getting together and loving their brothers and sisters, and they were eating the body and the blood of Christ, and they were worshiping the singular deity as opposed to the many gods of Rome. This happens in Rome when Rome decides to publicly endorse Christianity as their official religion of the empire. The church finds a way when the African American slaves here in our own country were not welcome to worship in white churches, birthing a movement of vibrant black churches in the United States, the legacy that's still apparent today. Under oppressive government regimes aiming to stomp out Christianity or religious freedom, the church finds a way to develop and to grow, oftentimes underground, in a way that we may not even see it if we're in a different society or culture. Let me be clear. I think sometimes when we see this adaptation in this movement, it doesn't always line up with what we would view as successful. It looks a little bit different. Instead, growth sometimes happens amidst persecution. It's pruning in mass adoption. Its inception can be seen in poor decisions, and sometimes its death can be seen in wisdom. Because the church finds a way regardless of the social acceptance of it. Brentis Salter McNeil writes this, that God's kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven, with or without our help. The only question is whether we will have the privilege of being part of what God is doing. And in this, the gospel presents itself in diverse realities and expressions where people can know who God is. The people in this city have different theological convictions or beliefs about God than we do here at the Foundry. And my prayer is that either we can come together as a community and we can wrestle with our beliefs in the context of community, or that there's another church here in the city that can meet them where they're at. Because I think a lot of time over the course of church history has been spent arguing over minor changes and minor doctrinal distinctions. But thank God there are different expressions of the church than just one. That people can find the church in a way that meets them where they are at. When we honor and respect and revere our differences, we can ultimately come together as the church overall and significantly impact more people. Because distinct expressions of faith are God-honoring, but divisiveness and competitiveness and vitriol towards other Christians is not. By connecting with and learning from the history of the people of God, we can see these diverse expressions of faith as God-honoring. When we see these diverse people representing the Imago Dei, worshiping God, we begin to see also that the church is much bigger than we realize. That it extends far beyond what we understand. Acts 1:8, Jesus gives a pronouncement to his disciples. It's one of the last things he says to them. He says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all of Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Or in other words, you're going to be my witnesses here locally, to our neighboring communities and cultures, and then to the entire earth. Oftentimes we can, here in America in 2021, we can make church history quite Eurocentric or Western-centric. And in doing this, we inaccurately understand the ways in which the gospel has moved and spread throughout different cultures throughout all of history. For example, here in the United States, we know from studies that actually the church is shrinking. Specifically, you can see this in studies, sociological studies that look at different generations and how Christianity impacts different generations. But also you can see it in conversations about race in the church, where white Christians are actually shrinking at a very fast rate. However, the church is growing in places such as China, India, South Korea, Africa, South America, some places that oftentimes we don't even attribute to Christianity. I'm going to show you this map on the screen, whether you're at home or you're in this room. It's an interesting map. It's kind of a nerdy map if you like nerdy things. But what it does is it takes all of the Christians at specific points of time and it plots them on a map. And it finds what is the central geographic location of all of those people. So obviously you can see that when the church was started, it was in the Middle East. You can see the 33 on there because that's where the church was started. You can see over the next 1,000 years, it moves more towards Turkey, and over the next few hundred years, it moves into Europe, as the church is moving more and more, honestly, towards Rome. In 1800, we see it, the centrality in Italy. In 1900 in Spain, you can't really see it, but in 1950, it's actually in the Atlantic Ocean. And then in 1970, it comes back to Africa, where the centrality there is in Morocco. And in 2010, the centrality here is in Mali, Africa. Because the growth of Christianity in the southern hemisphere is far outpacing the growth of Christianity in the northern hemisphere. And there is also this movement back to the east. Noted, as I said, in a lot of the places that Christianity right now is growing and booming. My point in all of this is to identify that there are people worshiping God that represent a diverse group of people, much larger and more expansive than oftentimes we even realize. And being a part of a church community should remind us of this. When we connect with and we learn from the people of God, we see diverse people representing the image of God, worshiping God, rather than limiting who his identity is, rather than limiting the movement of the church or the ability for people to find God. In the Old Testament, in the prophetic books, there's this book called Ezekiel. And it's written by this priest who's taken into captivity by the Babylons after the Israelites have been violently removed from their homes. He's displaced in this foreign land. He's witnessed all of this violence, and his city that he loved was burned to the ground. Now, admittingly, this book has some strange parts to it. If you just read it cover to cover, there's some very, very strange chapters. And what most modern scholars believe is that, in fact, Ezekiel had PTSD from what he had witnessed and what he had seen. And while he's suffering from PTSD and kind of wrestling through some of the flashbacks that he's having of the pain that he has experienced, he's also reflecting on several concepts of who God is. What does this mean for us as the people of God? He's asking questions of what does all of this suffering, how do we make sense of all of it with all of these promises of God? And here he's reminded that God has been faithful. He's asking these questions of what does it mean for just this geographic centrality, which previously had been Jerusalem, where there was the temple, where God's presence was. What does that mean now that we are displaced from that place? And well, there's evolution in their belief, and God is not limited to the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, he can be amongst a community of believers here in exile. So what about those practices that we did in the temple? Well, we can implement practices and draw on the old, but we can also fit them into more of a modern understanding. And what does that mean for this boundlessness now that the geographic centrality is not Jerusalem anymore? What does that mean for humanity? And for Ezekiel, there is this hope of this far greater expanse of people who can hear of God and worship his glory. It's a beautiful story of how faith shifts through these questions that Ezekiel is asking. Because Ezekiel, in the context of a community of believers, after experiencing this death and existential realities, he finds solace in connecting with these four different ideas. When we connect with and we learn from the history of the people of God, we can remember what God has done, which allows us to have hope for what he's currently doing and what he's going to do. We can see how faith has shifted and evolved over time, and we don't need to fear how things are going to change in our lifetime. We can better develop spiritual practices, and we can learn and grow from the experiences of others, helping us be more in tune with the heartbeat of God in ways that maybe someone else understands better than we do. And we can see that God has always worked and been represented by a diverse group of people across all nations and cultures. And he will continue to present in that same way. Even in heaven, when we read that every nation, tribe, and tongue is represented.